The morning fog rolled low across the Oregon rail yard, settling into the grooves of the tracks like pale smoke rising from someplace deep underground. It was colder than usual, the kind of cold that made metal ring sharply when touched. Miles Carter stood alone outside Bay 5, rubbing the sleep from his eyes with the back of his glove as he looked at the half-opened monster of an engine inside. It loomed in the dim light like the ribcage of a steel beast, its panels cracked open, wires, coiled bolts scattered like lost teeth. He hadn't meant to stay late the night before. He hadn't meant to stay at all. But there are some sounds a mechanic can't walk away from, not if he's got any conscience left. And when he heard the uneasy tremor in the hybrid locomotive the British team had brought in for demonstration, he knew something was wrong. Not wrong like a chipped screw or a lazy valve. Wrong like something breathing unevenly. Wrong like danger. He had worked until the night bled into morning fabricating a brace out of scrap, shaping it by instinct more than design. When he finally welded it into place, it didn't look beautiful. It didn't look even remotely professional. It looked like it had been bent by someone who cared more about survival than symmetry. Now, with dawn still struggling over the horizon, he stood staring at the broken patch he'd left in the heart of a prototype worth millions. He knew it would cause hell when the British engineers saw it, but he also knew one thing with absolute clarity: without that patch, someone would get hurt. Bootsteps clattered behind him, quick, crisp, authoritative. Mr. Carter Miles closed his eyes for half a second before turning. Chief Inspector Raymond Holt strode toward him, flanked by two British engineers. They all wore the same expression, irritation polished into professionalism. Holt's jaw was set like stone. "You performed unsanctioned work on the prototype," he said, voice clipped and cold. "At 1 a.m, no less." Miles nodded. "It needed reinforcing." "What it needed," Holt replied sharply, "was to be left alone until our team completed the morning inspection." Sutton and Reeves, Holt's two assistants, stood stiff behind him, both clutching clipboards. Reeves was already writing something down. Holt brushed past Miles and approached the engine. The moment he saw the patch, he stopped. His lips parted just slightly. The uneven weld curved like a scar across the joint. What Holt whispered is that Miles stepped beside him, a reinforcement brace. The joint was vibrating, felt like something was shifting under thermal strain. Reeves looked up. "We cleared the joint yesterday." "Yes, you did." Miles kept his voice calm. "But that was after the engine cooled." Holt turned sharply. "Are you suggesting my team missed a structural failure?" "I'm saying engines can hide their pain," Miles answered, "especially at the end of a long day." Holt stared at him for several seconds, then said, "Remove it." "No," Miles replied. Sutton blinked. Reeves nearly dropped his pen. Holt stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, you do not have the authority. I'm not removing it, because if I do, that joint won't survive under full load." Holt's eyes flashed. "You are a yard mechanic. We came here from 3,000 miles away to test a prototype designed by some of the best engineers in Europe. You think you know something we don't?" Miles exhaled slowly. "Right now, yes." Silence settled for a moment, thick as the fog. Holt straightened. "We will run diagnostics. If anything is out of tolerance, you'll explain yourself to the board." Sutton shot Miles an apologetic look. Reeves avoided eye contact. Holt raised his chin. "Begin setup." The team moved around the bay, connecting lines, activating panels, prepping the engine like surgeons before an operation. Miles watched with crossed arms, feeling the weight of inevitability pushing against his ribs. He didn't want to be right. Being right meant something worse was brewing inside that engine. The diagnostic began softly, a low rumbling rising from deep within the machine. Data flickered across screens. British eyes scanned it with practiced calm. "Temperatures nominal," Reeves said. "Vibrations minimal," Sutton added. Torque holding, Holt declared almost triumphantly. Miles waited. He always waited, because machines rarely confess their secrets until pushed. "Bring it to test load," Holt ordered. The rumbling grew. Wind from the intake washed over them in warm bursts. The nearby floor vibrated faintly. Then came a tapping so quiet, Miles was the only one who flinched. Holt glanced at him. "Is there a problem?" Miles didn't move. "Push it more." "That is unnecessary," Holt said. "The diagnostics." "Push it," Miles repeated. Sutton hesitated. "Sir, maybe we should. If he's wrong, it won't change anything. If he's right—" Holt set his jaw. Full load. The engine roared loud enough to rattle the lights overhead. Heat shimmered off the metal. Monitors jumped. A metallic cry, thin and sharp, echoed from somewhere beneath the housing. There Reeves shouted, "Look at the joint!" A hairline crack began to spider along the edge of the original weld, not the patch. Miles felt his stomach tighten. Sutton's voice came out trembling. "If that had happened during the run, we would have lost the engine," Reeves whispered. "No," Miles corrected softly. "You would have lost yourselves." The crack wasn't deep yet, but deep enough to reveal the truth. The patch was the only thing holding everything together. Holt stepped closer. His voice was quiet, almost hollow. "We would have been inside that cabin, at full speed." Miles didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The engine told the whole story. Holt reached out, touching the ragged piece of metal Miles had beaten into shape hours earlier. His fingers rested on it for a long moment, and then he said something no one expected. "Your patch looks broken, Mr. Carter." "Yeah," Miles replied. "But it's the only reason you're all still breathing." Sutton swallowed hard. Reeves sat down without realizing he had. Holt stepped back, the weight of realization settling onto his shoulders. We would have died." Miles nodded. "That's why I didn't sleep." Holt turned toward him, something fragile flickering behind his glasses. "We owe you an apology." Miles shook his head. "No. You owe yourselves a second chance at today." Holt let out a long, slow breath. "The demonstration is still scheduled. What do you suggest?" "We need to find the real failure," Miles said. "The patch is only buying time." "And can it buy enough?" Holt asked. Miles didn't answer, because truthfully the patch could fail at any moment under the wrong conditions, and conditions on a live test run were never predictable. Holt stared at the engine steel and heat and danger wrapped into one trembling machine. Then he turned to Miles. "We'll follow your lead." Miles nodded once. It wasn't victory. It wasn't pride. It was just a mechanic doing what needed doing. For the next 2 hours the bay filled with the sound of metal shifting and tools clattering. The British team worked shoulder to shoulder with Miles, now asking questions they'd never bothered asking before, measuring things they'd assumed were perfect. As the sun rose over the yard, glinting across steel rails, the engine seemed to breathe with them, no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be fine. Miles finally found it, a tiny manufacturing defect buried beneath a panel most people never touched. Something so small it might as well have been dust. But dust brought down mountains if ignored. He repaired what he could. The rest? The patch had to stay. By late morning, the prototype was rolled out onto the test line. The British engineers would ride inside. It was the only way to prove the machine and themselves had not come all this way for nothing. The crowd gathered. Reporters, officials, observers from both countries. No one knew how close they had come to watching a disaster instead of a demonstration. Holt climbed into the cabin last. He paused beside Miles. "If we survive this," he said quietly, "you'll have saved more than a project." Miles didn't smile. "Just listen to the machine. It'll tell you what it needs." Holt nodded. The door shut behind him. The engine hummed. Steam drifted across the tracks. The patch glimmered faintly in the winter sun, crooked, rough, undeniably alive. Miles stepped back as the locomotive prepared to move. He didn't pray. He just listened. Because he could already hear something shifting in the distance, something that would soon test every breath inside that engine. The air felt tighter around the test track, as if the whole yard were holding its breath. Spectators gathered behind the temporary barriers, representatives from the Transit Authority, journalists, students from the engineering college, even a few curious workers from the nearby shipyard. They all looked eager, unaware of how close the day had come to being carved into tragedy instead of achievement. Miles stood well behind the locomotive, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the British engineers now settling inside the cabin. He could see Holt through the window, straightening his vest, adjusting his glasses. Sutton was checking a panel, Reeves scribbling in a notebook even now. None of them looked frightened. Maybe they were hiding it. Maybe they were just too committed to their work to let fear break through. Either way, Miles felt something twist in his stomach as the engine exhaled a low, pre-run rumble. The fog was lifting, but not fast. It clung to the ground like a slow-moving tide. A rail worker waved a caution flag. The speakers crackled as an announcer reminded everyone that this was only a demonstration routine, controlled perfectly safe. Miles knew better. Nothing involving a machine under strain was ever perfectly safe. He stepped a little farther from the track, though he didn't take his eyes off that patch. It was still there, crooked and stubborn, holding the joint like a hand gripping a wound. It might hold. It might not. It had been built for survival, not beauty, but it was all they had. Inside the cabin, Holt leaned forward, pressing the intercom button. "We're ready." The announcer gave the signal. The WWII lurched forward slow at first, the weight of it settling into the rails. Its wheels groaned against the steel, gripping the track with a low growl. A warm gust pushed outward from the engine's side vents. Dozens of onlookers raised their phones to record. Miles felt the vibration move through the ground as the locomotive gathered speed. 10 miles per hour. 15. 20. A rhythm grew inside the engine, a familiar pulse, uneven at first, then smoothing as the machine found its stride. The crowd murmured with approval. Miles stayed quiet. He wasn't listening to the crowd, he was listening to the engine. At 30 miles an hour, the locomotive's sound deepened the way a long breath becomes steady after tension. The hybrid turbines engaged with a dull whine. The patched joint flexed, then steadied. For a moment, Miles let himself hope. Inside the cabin, Sutton leaned toward the main console. Torque consistent, temperature rising normally. Reeves nodded. "Feels smoother than this morning." Holt kept his hands braced on the railing behind the operator's seat, even though he wasn't driving. He watched the gauges like a man watching the heartbeat of something fragile. "Hold speed," he instructed the operator. The locomotive glided along the track, slicing through the thinning fog. Reporters snapped photos. A few students cheered. The director of the transit authority whispered something to his deputy, probably about budget approvals or public relations. Miles kept staring at that patch. After another half-mile, the locomotive reached the far curve of the track. This was the point Holt had planned for a controlled acceleration, just enough to show the engine's capability without stressing the system too far. The operator confirmed readiness, waited for clearance through the radio, then eased the throttle. The WRX-7 responded with a surge of power that rippled down the length of the machine. 35 miles an hour. 40. 45. The engine tone changed. Louder. Sharper. Less like a steady hum and more like a beast waking with a roar. The crowd loved it. Miles didn't. He stepped closer to the edge of the safety line, focusing on the slight shift in the engine's vibration. There was a tremor, tiny, fleeting, but real. The kind of tremor that didn't come from the rails or the wheels. Inside the cabin, Sutton felt it too. "Did you sense that Reeves swallowed?" "A little." Holt kept his voice steady. "Monitor the joint temperature." "It's fine," Sutton said. "Still in green." "Keep your eyes on it," Holt replied. The locomotive picked up more speed. 50 miles an hour. 55. The joint under the patch flexed again. Heat shimmered along the metal like a warning. The crooked brace held, but it pulsed with strain. Miles felt his heartbeat match the engine's rhythm. His breath fogged in the cold air. The locomotive thundered past him with a blast of wind, racing toward the second curve. Then something changed. Not the sound, not the speed, not the movement. Something deeper. A shift in pressure, almost like the engine exhaling differently. Miles's instincts snapped alert. He didn't hear a failure, but he felt the anticipation of one like air getting too still before a storm. Inside the cabin, Sutton shouted, "Temperature spiked 6 degrees in 4 seconds." Reeves scanned the readings. Pressure fluctuation too fast. Holt gripped the railing. "Throttle down." The operator reacted instantly, but the throttle resisted stiff under his hand. "It's not responding." Outside, Miles saw the slight jerk in the locomotive's posture, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to him it was loud as a scream. His chest tightened. No, not now. Not after everything. He ran along the track parallel to the racing locomotive. Shouts rose from the crowd as they noticed him sprinting. Inside the cabin, alarms chirped. Sutton tightened his harness. Reeves gripped the console. Holt forced calm into his voice, though his eyes betrayed fear. "We stay steady. No sudden changes. Let the machine find balance." But the machine didn't want balance. A grinding cry ripped through the rotary joint. The patch convulsed under the force. The engine shuddered violently. Passengers outside gasped as they saw the metal shiver. Miles shouted, though no one could hear him. "Hold together, just hold." Inside, Sutton yelled, temperature climbing 20 degrees. Reeves shook his head. "That's impossible." "No part should heat that fast," Brace Holt ordered. The locomotive screeched along the rails. Sparks spit from the wheels. Fog swirled violently around it. The joint beneath the patch twisted metal under torture. And then a crack. Sharp, final, fatal. The patch tore, not away, but tighter. It twisted into the failing joint, wedging itself like a hook anchoring two breaking bones. It wasn't built to do that. It wasn't built to survive this long, but it fought anyway, gripping the joint in a desperate crooked hold. The force that should have shattered the engine was absorbed by the patch instead. Inside the cabin, Holt felt the jolt, but not the explosion that should have followed. Sutton stared in disbelief. Reeves exhaled a strangled half-sob. The operator managed to regain throttle control. Holt shouted, "Slow to 15." The engine obeyed, slowly, groaning, agonized, but alive. The locomotive limped along the remaining track until it rolled into complete stop near the yard's far gate. The crowd was silent. Phones lowered. Fog drifted like ghostly breath around the motionless machine. Miles reached it moments later, chest burning from the run. He pressed a hand against the metal exterior as if feeling for a pulse. Alive. Barely, but alive. Inside, Holt removed his harness and stepped out of the cabin on shaky legs. Sutton and Reeves followed, both pale, both sweating, both suddenly aware of how close they had come to dying. The three stood near the track, catching their breath. None of them spoke. Miles approached, breath still ragged. Holt looked at him, really looked at him for the first time as a man whose life had been saved by another's hands. "Your patch," Holt whispered, voice cracking. "It saved us twice." Miles nodded quietly. "It wasn't meant to. It was just meant to hold until you were out of danger." Reeves pointed back at the engine. "It shouldn't have wedged itself like that. No piece of metal does that on its own." "It tried," Miles said. "Engines always try to survive. Sometimes we don't listen." Holt's eyes shined not with tears but with the shock of understanding. "If we had removed it, you wouldn't be standing here," Miles said simply. The fog thinned as the winter sun finally pierced through. The light hit the engine just right, reflecting off the crooked brace wedged deep inside the joint, scarred, warped, ugly, heroic. Sutton shook his head slowly. "We misjudged you." Miles shrugged. "You trusted your data." "I trusted the noise between the data." "It wasn't noise," Holt said softly. "It was truth." Workers gathered around the engine, stunned into silence. Officials whispered among themselves. A few reporters stepped forward, but a rail supervisor blocked them, giving the engineers time to breathe, to feel the weight of their survival. The three British engineers stood together, not in superiority, not in protocol, but in humbled gratitude. Holt turned to Miles. "We owe you our lives." "You owe the machine, too," Miles said. "It gave warnings. You just didn't hear them." Sutton let out a shaky laugh. "I'll hear every noise for the rest of my career." Reeves nodded. "Same." Holt extended his hand. It was not the stiff, formal handshake of earlier meetings. It was the shaken, grateful handshake of a man who had looked death in the eye. Miles took it. A moment passed between them that didn't need words. Later that afternoon, after the damaged locomotive was towed back toward the bay for inspection, Holt insisted on one thing: the patch should remain untouched. "It belongs where it is," he said, "just as it saved us." They stood around the engine once again, this time with sunlight warming the metal instead of fog chilling it. Miles stepped into the bay, leaned in, and touched the warped brace with the back of his knuckle. It was still warm from the run, warm like a heartbeat. Behind him, Holt asked quietly, "How did you know, Carter?" "Before any of us did." Miles took a breath. "I listened. Not with tools, not with checklists, just with everything I've learned since I was a kid fixing broken things. Every machine's got a voice. Most folks drown it out." Holt looked at the patch, the crooked hero. "We would have died today without that voice." Miles nodded. "Yeah. Outside, the late afternoon settled over the yard with a softness that didn't belong to winter. It felt earned. It felt grateful. Visitors had gone. Reporters drifted away with confused notes about an unscheduled halt. The transit authority insisted the full report would be internal. No headlines, no drama, just a quiet truth kept between the people who survived it. Holt approached the engine one last time, resting a hand on the battered metal. "We'll take this story home," he murmured, "and we'll tell it properly." Miles replied, "Just don't forget, the patch looked wrong before it looked right." Holt smiled, small, tired, real. Some things that save us do. As the sun set behind the old warehouses, casting long orange beams across the track, the British engineers stood with Miles in the fading light, united by a broken piece of metal that had saved their lives. And though the world would never know the exact moment the patch tore itself into place to shield them from catastrophe, the men who lived through it never forgot. Because survival doesn't always look beautiful. Sometimes it looks bent, sometimes it looks crooked, sometimes it looks broken, and sometimes, like that uneven piece of metal welded by tired hands at 1 in the morning, it's enough to keep people alive.